We have the buffer mapping project. I'm going to try to focus my time today on the portions that are most devices. You have the large challenge in this, helping us implement this law, and so we're doing the buffer mapping project to help you have products and tools and information to work with landowners so that you are able to work with them effectively. And so one of the probably the key things I'll say right out of the top here is that it's important that you be able to use the tools and the map and the information, and it's accurate enough so that you can do your jobs out there, and that's what our goal is out of this process. Landowners and local units of government being able to use the tools. So, buffer mapping project, basic background of clean water is the purpose of this law, and the clean water that we have came originally from intense vegetation across the entire landscape that filtered the groundwater systems, provided us with clean lakes and rivers and water resources, and so those systems are not there anymore. We have lost perennial vegetation in large areas of the state where we don't have as much on the landscape anymore, and as a result of the changes that we've made for a variety of good reasons, we're starting to see more and more impairments of the water resources that we have in the landscape, and thus it brings us back to the need to look at vegetation adjacent to waters and reevaluate how we're doing on that. And so the buffer law is in place that will help us start to address the impairments that we're seeing. Where buffers matter most, in my opinion, I have a groundwater background as well, is that we have aquifers that have recharge. They get their water from the surface ultimately, and we are taking more water resources out of the groundwater systems, and particularly in those areas of the state where we've lost the vegetative buffer, it's not present anymore, we have a concern that we need to make sure that we have those buffers back in places that are key where water is getting in to replace the water that we're taking out. And so the groundwater protection is as much or more important of a process in this buffers as well as just the surface water impairments that you've been hearing about. So with that, the law calls for the 50-foot average and the 30-foot minimum width for public waters. It also references state shoreline standards. In some cases, those are more restrictive than this law, and those would still apply. And it also allows for agricultural areas that alternative water quality practices. And for the other part of the system is that the public drainage systems are included in this law, and so the public drainage systems and the ditches within the benefited area of those public drainage systems are required to have the 16.5-foot buffer and or the alternative water quality practice at some point. So we staged this process that we're doing to develop these maps so that you have the tools necessary by trying to pull together the information that the law requires. We were not ready for this law in terms of having data layers that covered all these things that are referenced at the DNR. And I know that the local units of government and the drainage authorities, their records were not ready for this either. And so what we've been trying to do in phase 1 and phase 2 of this process is pull together the public waters information, get that into a format that is reasonably accurate, and show that on the maps that we will develop. And I'm using the pointer here is that preliminary buffer protection maps are what we're hoping to produce by February. And that would incorporate the public waters information and phase 1 that we're pulling together, and the phase 2 information to the degree that we can get it would be for the data from the public drainage systems. That is a bit more challenging on the public drainage side because there's a lot of paper records and formats and lots of different drainage authorities out there, and so that is a time-consuming process that is probably going to slow us down in some respects, and so we are altering up our phasing process even as we go so that we can incorporate that. I think a lot of the questions that we've heard through time has been positional accuracy. How can you use those maps? They're not in the right place and things are wrong, and we're seeing that on the landscape, that it's different than what's showing on the map, and we need to have the credibility that the maps are accurate when we're working with landowners so we know which water resources are actually being affected by this law. That is our important priority out of this process, but you need to bear with us as well as that we try to take this information that was in scanned map form in a lot of cases and create it into digital layers that will project well on the map. And so we will get those maps as accurate as possible. There will be a new buffer protection map that will be produced that we will use for this process that it will depend heavily on the Phase 3 process, where we put these two sources of information together, the public waters and the public drainage system information, and have you look at that for a couple different reasons. Is that check to see that the information that you provide is accurately depicted on there in terms of the benefited area public drainage systems and the drainage systems or the ditches that are within those benefited areas are the types of things that require the buffer under this legislation. So we will do that, and you will have in this the Phase 3 process. I'm going to kick ahead here. I'm going to actually drop back. I'll come back to the Phase 3 process in a minute. But in Phase 1, this is the public waters. There's a viewer tool out there that many people have already access to look at. That is our scanned map layer from the 79s, early 80s, so the late 70s, early 80s, when we produced the public waters maps. We need to use that information in this process, but we are not going to use that map exactly, because in not all cases is the map currently accurate for what's on the landscape anymore. And so we will be modifying that information to make it fit so that people know where the public waters are as they've been moved or altered. And then that public waters map is the base that we're working off of for this mapping process, and then we'll modify the alignments. We have criteria that we're using for the Phase 1 public waters. Is that anything that's public waters would require a 50-foot buffer, just like public water wetlands are one of the sub-classifications. With shoreline classification, they have a 50-foot buffer on those. Public drainage system ditches with a shoreline classification would have a 50-foot buffer. Those are water courses that have had are probably part of a river system that may have been altered through time, but we have always expected that they would have a shoreland designation classification that was part of the information we provided the counties and the cities at the time, and so those would continue to have a 50-foot buffer. For public drainage system ditches that have no shoreline classification, we're going to use the 16.5-foot buffer. For those of you who are familiar with our public waters inventory maps, these are typically shown as the dark dashed lines on the public waters map. Our intention is that those would have remain with the 16.5-foot. And for purposes of this legislation, although it's controversial to some, is that the public water wetlands, having no shoreline classification for them, we would not intend to show them on this map at this point. So, on the Phase 2 process is the public drainage system information that we need to incorporate into the map so that landowners know which ditches within those public drainage system benefit areas need to have buffers. We are looking at using LIDAR data to identify ditches within the watersheds. The challenge that we have with the LIDAR data is that it is not, we have it, but it has not been able to be added to the maps, and there's a lot of processing that's still not done on those layers that will still take some time, months to years, to get that all processed. And so we'll continue to be able to upgrade and change these maps through time so that they become more accurate for your purposes of using them with landowners. But as we start, they may not be as accurate as you'd like them to be, because we don't have time necessarily or dollars to get it all done right away in the time frames allowed by the law. But we will have tools that identify ditch landscape features that appear to have definable bed and banks and convey water, that we will, in this Phase 3 process, have you try to verify for us, based on your knowledge of the local landscapes out there, which ones are actually ditches that should have buffers on them according to this law, based on their banks and beds and being within the benefited areas, and that they're altered courses, ditches within those benefited areas. So we will have those criteria. We're working with Bowser on that as well, and so we will provide some additional training on some of those criteria for those ditches to help you figure out which areas of your county you believe should have the buffers, and which are features that really aren't ditch-like and shouldn't need to have the buffers, but alternate practices or other soil and water conservation measures may work as well or better. So that process will be coming up in Phase 3. We are in the process of asking drainage authorities to provide us their shape files of the benefited areas and any ditch layers that they have You may have seen emails from me, and we are about ready to launch a process to have people be able to download any of their digital data to our FTP site to start to process that so that we can start to incorporate that for those of you who have the data and are able to share it willingly soon, as that we'll start to incorporate that and process it to get it into our preliminary maps. That process will take an elongated period of time because not everybody's ready, and some of it is still in paper form and not ready to be put in, but we will continue to work with you and figure out how to get that information into the maps and be as accurate as possible, have you a chance to look at it to make sure that you're comfortable that it depicts what your data, you understand your data to show, and so that the official map that we produce by July will have the accurate information as much as possible on it. All right. Phase 2, I think I just covered all this stuff, is that we'll have the benefited areas as it comes in and flows in, and we'll show that. You can expect that the preliminary buffer protection maps, when we put them out, are going to change as we get information in, and so they will continually be updated, and so that they're going to be a fluid process because there's a lot of information we need to get in and have you be looking at, and so you may look at them when they first come out, and then after you know that your information has been incorporated in it, you might want to go back and double check that, and we'll keep in communication with you so that you know when we've been able to incorporate your data in and be able to take a look at it again. And so we'll do that process, and it will be limited to the ditches in the benefited areas. But as we start this process, since we will not have the benefited area information from all the counties and watershed districts that show the systems, is that we will probably end up starting with where we see ditch-like features on the landscape and have you start to look at those to see which ones you think actually qualify using the criteria that we'll share with you. All right, the phase 3 process is going to be the intensive review process. This is where you will look at these maps in more detail. We are going to encourage you to not get too hung up on the exact positional accuracy of what we show, but I think the important feature here that we are aiming for is that when you look at this map, as you work with landowners, will you be able to tell what ditch we're talking about or what water course that we know well enough that that's the one that would need to have the buffer as distinguished from something else in the landscape. And so we will have it accurate enough so that you can figure out approximately this is the one we're talking about and this is the one that would need the buffer. And then we can continue to improve the accuracy of that line work through time, but ultimately what you need to know is that is it required, and then we would expect that the way this process will implement is that you'll be reviewing landowners' work and their buffers and working with them directly and be able to help them on the ground figure out exactly where things start and stop. And so as long as you get in the right place in the first place on the right water course that we're dealing with, then you'll know that you are able to proceed with them in confidence, and then the map can be always updated and improved so that the accuracy, so that you're more and more comfortable with it, and it shows things on the landscape on the map as well as possible is the ultimate goal, but it may not be perfect to start with. So we will continue to have error and corrections to make it accurate through time. A quick series of examples. This is of the Faribault County. This is a base layer that we have just so that you're familiar with what the map system will look like as it comes out. This is actually a statewide layer that shows all the data, but we can zero it in right to a particular county and even down into tighter, smaller areas. Any place in the landscape you can look at. So this is the base that we'll be working from. To this base, we add the public waters information that we have on our public waters map so that people can see what are the public waters that are actually included. And on this map, you can see the solid blue lines, and there's green lines around the lakes, and then there's the blue dashed lines. And so these are all features of the public water inventory that will need a buffer of some degree, and some of these systems that are the dashed lines may end up also being 103E public drainage systems, and that may be the 16.5 instead. And so we'll go through this process in this phase 3 to validate what are public drainage systems and where are the benefited areas, and then distinguish them from the public waters so that we know which ones will have the 50 and which ones would have the 16.5. As we worked with Faribault County, they provided us with their ditch information, and this is what their public drainage system information looks like when we add it to the public waters. And so the purple lines start to show up as the additional features that would need the, these would be, I believe in all cases, these are the public drainage systems. And then to that layer, we also look at other altered natural water course layers and LiDAR information, and we can see additional ditch-like features on the landscape. And so if I were to, I don't know how to back and forth on this one, but the distinguishing between the, here. So if I go backwards, this is the public drainage system, and go forward, you can see the pink and the purple toggle in and out. And so these pink ones would most likely be the private ditches within the public drainage systems, but we don't actually know where the public drainage system benefited areas are in all cases yet. And so, but you can kind of see that there would be some features that would potentially be added, saying private versus public. And I realize that there is a debate going on and a concern of certain legislators about whether private and public were intended as this legislation, but all we can do for right now is that the way the language reads is it says ditches within the benefited area of public drainage systems. We're interpreting that face value and saying all ditches within the benefit area, and public and private. We think that actually on the landscape there are not much difference between the public and private systems in terms of water quality and whether they need a buffer or not. And so we're looking at fair and equitable here as well, saying if it looks like a ditch and it needs a buffer on the public system, a private system that is draining into that public system that also looks like a ditch, seems to make sense, saying that also should have a buffer on it. So we're proceeding on that fashion. If the legislature changes things up, we'll have to deal with that. But our plan is going forward saying these would be the systems that we're looking at as potentially including. So I'm going to zero in on a particular area. This red line on the right side of the map is actually a benefited area information provided by the Faribault County from the records. And as you look at it, we can see the ditches within that benefited area. And so we're looking at the pink and the purple, if you're able to discern those, as the features that would need the buffer according to the law. And we have tools, the LiDAR information statewide that helps. And in this particular example, the red is basically landscape, but the yellow features are where we see an elevation change that allows us to see cuts, ditches here, as I might outline, where the dark line is in the center. And then there are also elevation features such as roads here, where the yellow is in the center here, and that would be a high feature. But we can see basically elevation changes on the landscape, and this helps us see ditch-like features. And so we're looking at this saying, where are the ditches out there, and do they need a buffer or not? And so as we go into this phase 3 process, we are hopeful that a local review team that probably would consist of what I at least have heard, maybe the SWCD, the county staff, and watershed district staff as appropriate, and you could bring in other people too, say, let's take a look at that, so let's do a review of our county, see what we think actually needs the buffer, make recommendations back through the process to us about that, using some criteria that we would provide you to help discern which ones don't, and use that process to fine-tune this map as we go. This is just an example of a field here, and we have a public water course outlined here. It's in the blue line here, and then we have a 50-foot buffer applied on that based on the center line of that. You can see in this particular case, the landowner actually has a wider buffer than the 50-foot, and it in almost all cases, and it parallels that. And so this is, if there are buffers in the landscape, there's nothing people would have to do it. They're probably already compliant. And then on the red line here is the water course that is now a ditch system, and we have the 16.5 shown on here as the purple. That's not just the line itself. That actually would be the water course plus the buffer on it. And so it's a fairly minimal footprint on the landscape, but it would show how that would actually look. And so when you have these maps, you will be able to zoom in and be able to see things like this and use that to determine how things work. So, all right, I'm going to just quickly go through the challenges and process opportunities we have in this. We have data processing for the maps that are going to be a challenge that we continue to work with you and others to do. We're having the criteria for our ditches that are very important to landowners out there. Everybody wants to know, will mine be in? Is my scrape ditch or my swale or things like that going to be in? I think that our intention is that if it's not a ditch-like feature, and I think we're looking at definable bed and banks within the benefited area of a public drainage system and altered in its form where it's been straightened, widened, deepened, we're looking for those types of features in the landscape. And so as you do your review, and we'll provide that criteria in writing to you and some guidance, and we'll do some training actually on how to do some field interpretations if you're not sure as you make recommendations into us. And so the Phase 3 process really is about you helping us understand how this law applies actually on the landscape out there and what makes sense and what should have the buffer and what shouldn't, so that we can do that. And we need to do it in a consistent process statewide so it's not distinctly different in one county to the next. And so we'll be providing some oversight on that, but you'll have a process to help us with that criteria. It's important that we assist the local units of government in this Phase 3 review. This is a lot of people that are going to be nervous and having questions and input, and we want to help you in that process, understand the tools, how we're attempting to do that, and help in a input process so that you get the information into us and you have the ability to talk with your landowners that have questions and help them understand how this is going to roll out and that their voices will be heard some way through this process, preferably through you, because you will then be able to review what they're asking for and make sure that you agree on what their suggestions and their concerns are. And then ultimately we need to help landowners and local officials be successful. They have the heavy lifting on this job. It is important that we see the buffers on the landscape for the water quality and the drinking water protection ultimately, but we need to help you be successful because this will be done best when it's done locally and you have good trusting and working relationships with your local landowners. All right, just basic information. We have some challenges with on the processing of the data. We got to convert the paper to digital. You're going to have to bear with us and test that and review it to make sure that we're as accurate as possible. We're looking to eliminate errors out of that, but it is creating new layers in a short period of time. We have over 100 drainage authorities that have information that we're trying to get into this process in different formats and level of quality. We'll have the review and the quality control for accuracy is going to come heavily in this Phase 3 process, so we'll be looking for suggestions and changes. We will have a comment tool that allow you to identify a reach or a point or a polygon and tell us what concerns you have in that particular area, so you can look at the map, highlight an area, provide a comment and say, this is wrong, it needs to be fixed, it needs to be this or that. And so we have simplified tools so that you don't have to make this up as you go, but you'll be able to comment into us through a process that is hopefully simple and easy for you. There are some funding and time constraints on this, obviously, too. We have the ditch criteria. I have it down here to a degree. And basically, I'll skip right to the bottom. Water quality is the purpose of the law. We want the local control to guide the map and have the follow-up, fair and equitable among landowners, and then solid criteria to minimize the need for dispute resolution. We want this to be simple and understood as possible, and so what we're really looking for are definable bed and banks that is connected to the public drainage system, and it's moving on to downstream waters, and that it's within the 103E benefited area of the system, and it's either an alter or an artificial channel. And so those are the things by the law that have to have a buffer on it, and these would have the 16.5 is what we're looking at for these in the benefit areas of the public drainage systems, and that's what we're trying to not show more than that, but show what is at least minimally meeting the criteria or reasonably meeting the criteria actually of a ditch that fits this law. We'll work with the local units of government. It's going to be an intense process. Criteria and guidance to manage the process is critical. We have the tools. We want it to be orderly and efficient, and we know that there will be changes that we're going to need in the future, and that it's all done in tight time frames because landowners have to have them in on the public water systems by November 1st of 2017, or for the public drainage systems by November 1st of 2018, and also the SWCDs have the requirement to do the other waters portion that's not shown on the map that might still need a buffer by July of 2017. And so we have to do our part, get it done as well as possible so that others can get on with their part. So in the end, good maps we're looking for, local knowledge and good tools, and recognizing how we help the work and relationships with the landowners to make this successful and provide adequate support and funding. So, do we have questions? I think I'm going to skip this part. I've already covered this, so.